Hi, my name's Andy Rourke and I'm the designer of Coalition. And I thought today I'd like to just talk through the thought process of how I designed Coalition. To start off with, I knew I wanted to come up with a mechanic based around the idea of win-win, so that players had to kind of negotiate between each other, giving something to receive something, and the limits to how much they were willing to give and receive would limit their movement or action ability within the game. That was the overriding mechanic I wanted to use. I knew I wanted to use this in a grand strategy game, and I knew I wanted it to be a Napoleonic game, a Napoleonic War game. So obviously, with a negotiation type game, the higher player count helps for the ability to negotiate and gives you more options. So I wanted it to be 6 player, but also wanted to be able to make sure that it worked just as well for 2 players as it does for any other number of counts, 3, 4, 5. And for the game to have the same rules for all player counts. I didn't want any special rules. And that was quite an important criteria from day one when I started designing. The mantra in my head was no special rules. And I think as a designer, it's quite important that you kind of hold on to some core ideas, because once ideas start coming thick and fast, it's easy to drift off course. So I wanted a win-win game. That was the mechanic. I wanted it to be grand strategy, up to 6 players, and no special rules for different player counts. I also decided I didn't want there to be any dice in the game. I didn't want there to be luck. I wanted it to be driven by players' choices. So these choices of who to choose to allow you to go and how many times you're going to ask the person to be able to go, I wanted those 2 things to balance out. So the more you did something, the more it would cost you and the more your opponents would gain, but you would gain by being able to do things. So there's this balancing act between how much you can or want to do and how much you'll risk doing. So then I needed to decide whether this was going to be some sort of cooperative game, all the players against the board, or whether it was going to be a competitive game where players were trying to beat other players. I thought about both scenarios quite a bit. Initially, erring towards wanting to make some sort of cooperative game. Being in the Napoleonic Wars, there was a lot of cooperation between nations. France fought most of the nations, but at sometimes virtually all of those nations were on France's side at different times. Some of them were on Britain's side. Really, the only 2 nations that never allied themselves were Britain and France. Everybody else at some point seemed to have either fought or favoured both sides. So there was room there for players to be able to form alliances and teams, but it was never going to be a complete cooperation game, everyone against the board. So it had to be a competitive game. And so then I started thinking, okay, so if it's going to be competitive, what are the victory conditions going to be? If there's only, say, a British-led coalition or France that can win, what's the point of the other nations? So each nation needs to be able to win in its own right. And so deciding on a way that the nations could interact with each other and to try and gain the most advantage or most influence or whatever you decide to, prestige, whatever you want to call it. So at the end of the game, one nation comes out on top as the nation that has benefited the most from the wars and has gained the most, whether that's through prestige or territory gain or whatever the criteria is going to be for that. So I decided on this win-win mechanic. I decided on it's going to have to be competitive, but allowing nations to become friends and work together when it suited them, and perhaps not when it didn't suit them. So that gave me a framework of the things I had to work out. How am I going to make all these mechanics work? What can I do to make these mechanics interesting decisions? Because the whole point of a good game is to give the player interesting choices and difficult choices, but not to overwhelm the players. If you've got too many choices, the player can get a bit stuck and not knowing what to do. So only having 2 or 3 or maybe 4 choices at any time is enough if you make those choices difficult and important choices. And that's where the fun in the game comes from. The choices, who you're going to interact with and how you're going to do that to your advantage. So this win-win mechanic, I had to start working on how I can do that. What can I make one player have an advantage whilst the other player also gains an advantage, but the two advantages be different? And so both players are measuring whether it's worth letting the opposite player or opponent gaining that advantage over them. So this is where I was to start with. This was the start point of my design process. Over the next few videos, I'm going to talk about how I coped with some of these decisions, these mechanics I had to work out. And so hopefully you'll enjoy listening to them. If you like this video, please subscribe to Formsquare Games. You can join and like my Facebook page at Formsquare Games, or you can sign up for newsletter. Okay, thanks very much.